exposure about global supply chain was when I was a kid. I grew up in the coffee farm, and that's the main crop that we produce. And the price we could not control it was mostly fluctuation on international markets. So that's kind of one that motivated me to study economics, because producing coffee, not be able to transform it, we were able to sell it to people that were buying it and they transform it a little.
Right.
However, they keep saying, hey, prices are fluctuating in international market. We don't know what that means at the time. So that was my kind of first exposure.
Okay.
Later on, when I moved to the US, worked for Walmart in the store and in the corporate office. Many products that we were selling in the store were coming from countries like China, India, Pakistan. So I have exposure of the supply chain in terms of when it's coming, why is it taking so long, when are we going to receive the next order, because of that long lead time coming from another country. When I moved to the home office again to take over replenishment for multiple categories, I have true exposure, direct contact with supply chain, goods coming from China, India, Pakistan. So it's basically something that started early on as a kid, you know, later on moving to the US and was hands-on on understanding where those products were coming from, and why transportation logistics was key in making sure that we had it. Right before COVID, what I can say about supply chain, it was relatively resilient, meaning that it's not that we never have any disturbance or disruption, but it was being resolved very in the short term. Okay. As many of you might probably know, many countries decided to lower the barriers like tariffs, to lower some of the rules that facilitate the flow of goods and services. So supply chain was relatively reliable. You know, you order something, it takes very short amount of time to come from another country to the US.
Right.
Why? It's because the system in place, we do not have big major disturbance or dysfunction in the whole process. And what happened with COVID is that COVID was not something that affected a particular country. For example, in 2011, we have a major earthquake in Japan, but only partner of Japan were affected by this earthquake. Partner of Japan, I mean, countries that were buying from Japan or selling to Japan were affected by this major natural disaster.
Right.
But with COVID, it's a different story.
Right.
It spread out from China end of 2019, beginning of 2020 to all countries, most of the countries in the world.
Right.
And second, those countries took action also to try to limit the spread of it.
Right.
So COVID is different in terms of the scale of the spread of the virus, and also the scope in terms of how many countries were affected. So bigger in magnitude, bigger in the scope, bigger in terms of the type of action taken by policymakers in order to stop the spread of that. If you go back before COVID started, for the past 3-4 decades, most of the countries have engaged into what we call globalization. What does that mean? That means countries acknowledge that it's beneficial for them to trade between them instead of just live, you know, in a closed setting. So they decide to lower the tariffs through the World Trade Organization, and many of them actually create things like NAFTA, US, Canada, and Mexico. On all those initiatives to lower the number of friction or obstacle was to facilitate the trade of goods. Because when you trade, you can specialize into something that you like, you are good at, become more efficient, and expand your market.
Right.
So before COVID, countries also acknowledged that they can buy inputs from other countries at a lower cost. The good news is that without a major disturbance or disruption, the supply chain was resilient, meaning that we might have short disruption, like for example Chinese New Year between January and February, but it was being resolved very quick. That's what we mean by resiliency. So from the time of before COVID with the resilient and stable supply chain to the transition of COVID, post-COVID, is the fact that many countries also were too dependent on other countries in terms of the input that they need for the manufacturing. And that also is a major sometimes security concern.
Right.
So with COVID happened, the big change is that one country acknowledged they are too exposed in terms of reliance on other countries. Second, many countries acknowledge that transportation logistics play a key role.
Right.
You can find the cheapest option of input, for example, from Malaysia or Vietnam. But how are you going to move those goods to the US? You need reliable transportation. And something that COVID helped policymakers and business leaders acknowledge is that maritime transportation through containers play a key role. Railroad play a key role. Trucking plays a key role in the economy. So with COVID, all those disruptions happening, is a time for policymakers and business leaders to sit down and say, okay, one, do we have structure in place to fix that? Okay. So big changes in terms of the whole supply chain being disturbed, and second, ability for policymakers to acknowledge that they have been quite a bit dependent on other countries for their own economy. Part of supply chain we're referring to, is it where are we, the sourcing part of it? Is it the logistic transportation part of it?
Right.
Or is it the transformation part of it? So all those questions we need to address, case by case. I mean, they are all, compelling, but we need to address case by case. For the case of port infrastructure, like you were referring to, the good news is that we acknowledge that we depend on a lot of couple of ports in the US. The port of Los Angeles and Long Beach account for almost 40% of the container traffic in the US for import goods coming to the US. That means that if those ports have disruption, it's difficult for most of the firms in the US to have input on time. Okay, so it's a good thing that government say, well, you know what, maybe we need to increase the capacity of other small ports. That way, most of the container coming to the US don't have to go through those hubs, which are LA, Long Beach, or New Jersey, or New York. So that's one thing very important that we learned from COVID: diversify the capacity to be able to build a resilient supply chain. Now, to your second point you mentioned about sourcing, should we bring back most of the manufacturing setting where we are used to offshore to other countries? Well, the answer is probably yes, but we have to acknowledge that it's not easy to always bring all the capacity back to one point.
It's not simple.
Because why in the first place do we decide to go somewhere else? Probably because of cost, labor cost. Or by deciding to bring the whole thing at once in the US, are we going to be able to pay workers high and still compete with other countries? So that's a challenge and dilemma. So, but it's a trade-off. What government, those are options on the table, okay? Those options on the table. Maybe it's a good thing that we can diversify instead of relying only on countries, majorly in the Asia. Maybe we can probably diversify more with Mexico, which is closer, for example. So it doesn't matter what option you have to choose. It's just how can you minimize the risk. But at the same time, how can you maintain in the way that is sustainable in the long term?
So